Good evening. My name is Deirdre Cross, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I just want to offer you a very warm welcome on a very chilly evening to what we think is going to be a wonderful discussion. The National Museum of African American History and Culture is pleased to join the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum and the U.S. Mint on this wonderful occasion to honor Ida B. Wells. She will be the 16th woman recognized as part of the U.S. Mint's American Women's Quarter program. A pioneering investigative journalist, suffragist, civil rights activist, and a founding member of the NAACP, Ms. Wells used her powerful voice to speak out against lynchings and other forms of violence against African Americans, bravely exposing the truth at a time when doing so was perilous. Hers is a narrative that's emblematic of so many presented in the galleries of this great museum. And so without further ado, I'd like to bring up Dr. Elizabeth Babcock of the Smithsonian. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to get this right. Smithsonian American Women's History Museum to take us further into the welcome for tonight's discussion.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. It is great to see you, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm really glad to be here tonight and appreciate your joining us. So tonight we're honoring the legacy of the activist and journalist Ida B. Wells, and we're celebrating the partnerships that made this quarter and this event possible. So as the new director of the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, cultivating partnerships between the Smithsonian museums and institutions like the United States Mint has been one of the things I'm most excited about. And just by way of background, I'm relatively new, so I'm in my 6th month. So I'm really enjoying getting to be part of something so historic so early in my tenure. Partnerships allow us to learn from one another, reach a wider audience, and in this case, make women's history tangible. The American Women's Quarters program is inspiring because it gives people an opportunity each and every day to encounter courageous women like Wells who changed American history. Wells was a meticulous investigator and a tireless crusader against racial violence, often at the expense of her own livelihood and personal safety. Her unwavering dedication to confront injustice brought her to Washington, D.C. on numerous occasions. She met with Presidents McKinley and Wilson to advocate for an end to discrimination, and she boldly marched alongside white delegates in defiance of an order to segregate the suffragist parade in 1913. While many people know her name, the details of her activism and accomplishments are often untold or overlooked. We believe that all of us benefit from a deeper historical understanding of the women who shaped our American history. Our museum, which is new, not yet built, is dedicated to expand the story of America, to include these untold and often overlooked accomplishments of women, so that we can all better understand our past and inspire our future. So I'm really grateful to Deirdre and the National Museum of African American History and Culture for hosting this event so that we can come together tonight in honor and conversation around Ida B. Wells. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our partner in this effort, April Stafford. April is the chief of the Design Management Office at the United States Mint.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It is a privilege to be here on behalf of the United States Mint to celebrate the Ida B. Wells Quarter with you. This is the first coin released this year as part of the United States American Women Quarters program. This exciting coin series uniquely honors extraordinary women who boldly shaped United States history. And it is fitting that Ida B. Wells leads the list of American Women Quarter honorees for 2025 because she was truly a trailblazer. As an educator, reporter, suffragist, civil rights pioneer, and a founding member of the NAACP, she challenged our nation to confront its darkest truths. Ida B. Wells overcame colossal barriers to become one of the most formidable journalists of her time. The Ida B. Wells Quarter shows her standing tall with a courageous, determined gaze. It's designed to reflect her unshakable spirit and includes inscriptions noting her significant contributions as journalist, suffragist, and civil rights activist. The artist included a quill brooch on her suit's lapel to signify the importance of the written word in her fight for justice. As they go out into the world, each coin will carry a small piece of Ida B. Wells' legacy, and every quarter has the potential to educate or spark conversations. Most importantly, these coins honor Ida B. Wells for fighting for equality throughout her life. We're proud to preserve and share her story through this quarter and hope these coins inspire Americans to always remember that truth matters, justice matters, and like Ida B. Wells herself, one voice can change the world. We're grateful to all of the partners that have helped bring this celebration to life. So at this time, I would like to acknowledge some of those folks with a special gift. Deirdre Cross, would you please join me? On behalf of the United States Mint, I'm pleased to present 2 American Women Quarters in honor of Ida B. Wells in this shadow box, one from each of our production facilities in Philadelphia and Denver, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you for helping us honor Ida B. Wells' legacy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Here? You want to sit down?
Thank you.
All right. And Michelle and Dan Duster, will you please join me? All righty. On behalf of the United States Mint, I'm pleased to also present to you 2 American Women Quarters in honor of Ida B. Wells in this shadow box, one from each of our production facilities in Philadelphia and Denver. As Ida B. Wells' family and subject matter experts in your own right, you were instrumental in the development of this quarter. Thank you for that and for your continued efforts in preserving and honoring her legacy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. I think they want some work over there. Actually, I'll be on this side. You guys can come. Okay. Thank you. So before I close, I'm excited to share that each of you will also receive your very own Ida B. Wells Quarter tonight. Yay! So before you go, please visit my colleagues at the United States Mint's table in the back. And for those viewing online, bags and rolls of these quarters will be available on February 4th through our website at usmint.gov. So thank you again, and I look forward to the panel's discussion.
Thank you again, April. I'm back now because it is really indeed my honor to welcome to the stage an esteemed group of panelists to join us this night tonight, and I'm delighted to introduce them, starting with Dan Duster, a motivational speaker and success coach, and he's also the great-grandson of Ida B. Wells. A prolific lecturer, he talks about her struggles and triumphs in the late 1800s to motivate audiences to address the challenges we face today. Joining him is Michelle Duster, an author and public historian who's worked for over 30 years to highlight positive contributions of African Americans and women, including her paternal great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. In order to share this rarely shared history, she has written, edited, or contributed to dozens of articles and authored over 20 books, serving on numerous monument commissions and to memorialize the life and work of her great-grandmother. Regina D. Langley is a museum specialist here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life. She currently researches, documents, and photographs the intersection of Black women's faith and fashion. And last but not least, our moderator this evening is Augustus Durham, and he's an assistant professor of English at the University of Toronto. His research interests span numerous centuries to account for the emergence, presence, and meaning of Blackness in modernity. Please join me in a warm welcome for our panelists. A little housekeeping first, though.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for being here with us. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the panel discussion, and please also want to let the panelists know that this is an open discussion, so all of you can add and subtract as you see fit. Given the nature of this event, I want to begin with the panelists providing a brief history of Ida B. Wells to you all. I say this because often at these kinds of occasions, people who attend the event know the person but don't know the person. So whether just an armchair introduction by the panelists or the history of her relative to their respective proximities, I guess let's begin with Ida B. Wells as a historical figure.
I'll start. So Ida B. Wells is born in slavery in 1862, and she's only a slave for 6 months because the Emancipation Proclamation goes into law on January 1st, 1863. She's in her early 20s when she has the incident on the train, and then she's in her 30s when she starts her, what's the word I'm looking for? Her, when she becomes the editor for the paper. And then, so we start to think about Ida B. Wells and put her kind of in history. Ida B. Wells is almost the same age as the Black Lives Matter organizers. She's in her late 20s, early 30s. And then her friends are lynched, and she's 30 years old when her friends are lynched. And then she is 34 when Plessy versus Ferguson is implemented into law. And she is 47 when she becomes a founding member of the NAACP. So I'll just leave it there to kind of give you an overview of how she fits into history.
Well, as hopefully most of you know, she was well known as a journalist, a pioneering data journalist. And what that means is that she was among the first in journalism to use data to basically create what I call a case for public in the court of public opinion, because the legal system was not on her side. So she collected data and was very precise about information, times, dates, and names of people who were lynched. And she also, I mean, just to give a perspective of what she did as a journalist, she also would take information that was from the mainstream newspapers and excerpt information in order to combat what actually happened. And so she used the information to basically have people tell information that was, well, she used people to incriminate themselves. And I really think that's important today in the atmosphere that we're living in, to know how and why she became a historical figure when it comes to journalism. She also was a suffragist. And for some people, you know, some younger people are like, what is suffrage? They haven't even heard the word. Suffrage is the right to vote. And she was a suffragist who fought for the right to vote. Women did not have the right to vote until technically 1920, when the 19th Amendment passed. But for black people, for most black people, it was 1965 when the Voting Rights Act. So she was involved in the suffrage movement. And she also was a civil rights activist for all other kinds of rights that black people and women were fighting for. And so hopefully that gives a little bit of overview of the kind of work that she did. She was also, some people consider her to be a social worker because she started the Negro Fellowship League on the south side of Chicago, which provided housing for migrants who were coming from the south to the north. And she helped people find jobs. And so most people would consider her to be a journalist, a suffragist, a civil rights activist, and a social worker.
Yeah. No, so she was really so I agree. And she was really a fighter for justice and equality. And so all of those things fall under that umbrella. Some other things that she did that a lot of people don't know about, the incident on the train was 1884. She was forcibly removed from the rail car. She had a first-class ticket, a ladies' ticket, which was the equivalent of first class. And at the time, you had the Jim Crow laws, so she had ridden there several months before then and had become accustomed to going there because of the Jim Crow laws. Now, at that time, the conductor said, you need to go to the smoking car, which was the black car. And she was like, no, I'm a lady. And she was a very distinguished woman. So she was forcibly removed from the train, fought the conductor physically at that point, and then decided to sue the railroad and won. So a black woman sued the railroad in 1884 and won. So 70 years before Rosa Parks. That was later overturned, so she ended, instead of winning, she had to pay. For the lynching incident, she had 3 friends who were lynched, and as Michelle said, she was a data journalist, but she was really America's first investigative journalist. So as we do now, we may see some things, or at least maybe 20 years ago, you largely believe whatever you read. Now we do a little more background checks. But back then, you know, if you read something in the paper, you took it as fact. When her friends were lynched, a few days later, pretty much the papers said these thugs did this, that, and the other, and she was like, wait a minute. She was actually godmother to one of the lynching victims, and so one of his children. And so she literally went and investigated 250 plus lynchings on her own and became the investigative journalist. She initiated a boycott of the rail car in Memphis after that incident. She traveled to Great Britain to initiate a boycott of the U.S. We were the largest exporter of cotton. Great Britain was the largest importer. So just a phenomenal figure all around, and you know we could go on for the rest of the night to talk about that. But those are some other things that I think are important to contextualize who she was and what she did. And also an entrepreneur. So she raised her own funding, and she took her hand in marriage with Ferdinand Barnett, who was a prominent civil rights attorney in Chicago. And he pursued her for quite a while, and what sealed the deal, and maybe not sealed the deal, so I don't want to fabricate, but Ferdinand was the owner of the Chicago Conservator, which was Chicago's first black newspaper. So part of the deal for marriage was she needed to be the owner of the Conservator. So she was a savvy negotiator and entrepreneur as well.
Thank you for that. I guess in light of us talking about her journalism, I want to bring up that certainly this week is a peculiar one with the event that happened a few days ago, that being the inauguration. And in particular, that the election correlated, and recent ones before that, with talking points such as fake news. With the media and the press becoming an increasingly, if not already, precarious institution, Wells' journalistic integrity feels relevant to the day. How might we understand the journalism of Wells and how that work required not only her integrity, but her courage?
She was non-conventional in the ways in which she gathered. So she read newspapers. At that time, it was mostly white men that were writing. So she took all the data that they wrote, and then she collected it, and then she looked at it and said, you know, the reason that black men are being lynched is not because they are raping white women. It doesn't have anything to do with it. But the other thing that was so unique about her was that she went into the community after the lynching and talked to the people. So for instance, there were 3 men, I think, in it was St. Louis or East St. Louis, that were being, that was supposed to be lynched. And she goes and she dresses up like a man and goes into the prison to talk to them. And I love the story where she, as a theologian, so when I'm reading this, I'm looking at, because she uses the story of Paul and Silas. And she says to them, I know you're thinking about dying, you're singing songs about dying. She says, but why don't you start singing songs about living? And so, and she said, and maybe that may be the impetus that changes the judge's heart and sets you free. And many years later, one of the guys, it was 3 of them, one of the guys came to Chicago to meet her to tell her that he was indeed one of the men that she had visited in the prison. So she did a lot of different things that, because she had so much, she was really a student of her craft. She really did do the research and gathered the facts. Like, she didn't just think like, okay, I'm going to read what's in the paper because I know what's in the paper is not necessarily true. And because in today's society we have, you know, everybody thinks they can have something to say because of the internet, and everybody thinks they're an expert on everything. She was actually an expert in investigative journalism. So.
Right, as Michelle alluded to earlier, is that she would take, and Regina just said, look at the what was written in the white newspapers, and use that information against them. Again, during her time frame, this is late 19th century. There were writings of, as the U.S. expanded and had the conflicts with what were referred to as Indians at the time, of course, natives, is they would call the Indians barbaric and this, that, and the other, and talk about what happened. And she was like, wait a minute, if you're calling them barbaric for doing these atrocities and white men are doing this to black men, then what are you? And so really, like I said, being the investigative journalist and being well-read so that she's an expert, so that she can use, not only have information, but their information, and truly use that against them to affect change.
And I think also it's important to note that she's about 10. I think she's about 10 when she's reading the newspaper. So she has a worldview that's very different than most, because at the age of 10, she's reading the newspaper almost daily to her father and his counterparts. So at 10 years old, she's reading to them what is actually happening in the world. So you start to think about Ida B. Wells and place her in history and place her along her counterparts. She's well ahead of them. And so she already has a concept of what is in the newspaper because she's reading it at such a young age. And so she knows what's happening in the world, and she also has a world view as a result of reading the newspaper daily, and also understanding the importance of having newspapers in all black homes so that they could read the newspaper and, counter the narrative that is out there about what's happening with black people.
Actually, the one incident that Regina referred to happened in Elaine, Arkansas. There was a riot, a quote riot, that happened, and there were 9 men who were put on death row. And what happened in Elaine, Arkansas, was that there were sharecroppers who decided to unionize because they knew that they were getting ripped off financially from their labor. And so as far as putting Ida in a historical context and what happened in Elaine in historical context is, this was in 1918, and so it was at the end of World War I. So there were some veterans who were part of this community in Elaine, Arkansas, who they had gone overseas to fight for freedom and democracy for other people. So they came back to this country in their own community and were like, we're not tolerating not having freedom, democracy in our own country. And I really think that's important when it comes to the Black experience in general, is like the effect of the veterans. Because right after World War I and right after World War II, there were surges of, freedom, and we're not going to tolerate being second-class citizens. So these people in Elaine, Arkansas, decided they were going to unionize in order to stop getting ripped off, and the people in the community, the white people in the community, had a problem with that. And they ended up attacking the church where they were having their meeting. Shots were fired, and one white person got injured. So then the white people in that community decided to burn down everything. We've heard this story how many times in our history. And then the black men were considered the aggressors. And they were the ones that were rounded up and put on death row. And so Ida, in that situation and multiple situations, she heard about it. I mean, she was in Chicago. So she heard about what happened, and she decided to go for herself to see what happened. And she visited these people on death row and heard their side of the story. And she wrote a whole pamphlet about it. If you all want to read it, it's online, The Elaine, Arkansas Riot. And so, that fits into what she was talking, because, of course, the narrative at that time was these brutes, have come and they're, aggressive and they're dangerous. And it's like, no, they were defending themselves because the church was the one that was attacked, and they were the ones that, fought back. And so what we're dealing with even right now, and I know that wasn't part of the question, but her work is relevant today because a lot of the struggles are very similar to black people being villainized for defending themselves, and then that being a justification for brutalizing us. And we can go down the list of cases that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years of that being the situation. So she was going to see what really happened. She was talking to the people who were involved in that situation and asked them their side of the story, and what published that. So she wasn't allowing the, quote, mainstream media to drive these false narratives of demonizing people who were actually defending themselves.
Thank you for those responses. As someone who teaches a red record, this is a pamphlet that Ida B. Wells wrote on lynching, and has written on Frederick Douglass in my first book. I'm interested in Ida B. Wells and intellectual genealogies. What I mean by that is Douglass lives the better part of the 19th century, 1818 to 1895, and writes a preamble to a red record right before his death. Wells is born right before the Emancipation Proclamation, and and dies on the heels of World War I, and certainly to Martin Luther King's birth around this same time. Her knowing persons, like Douglass and W.B. Du Bois, among others, man and woman alike, suggest that her life is singular, yet also in conversation with those who precede her, are contemporary to her, and those who follow her. Can you all discuss briefly the intellectual genealogy Wells is a part of, to give also a fuller picture of her life?
I actually took notes, so I wouldn't forget, because I knew I might get nervous. And actually, as far as the intellectual genealogy, I did address some of that in my book, Ida B. the Queen, which hopefully you all can get from the bookstore here and online. But it is important to contextualize her, because she didn't, spawn out of nowhere and have no friends and no compadres and no, mentors or whatever. I mean, she lived in a community, and I think it's very important for people to know that she was part of a whole community and people influenced her. So, I mean, she was a contemporary of Booker T. Washington and Mary Church Terrell, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who was a suffragist in the Boston area. She was also a contemporary. She worked very closely with William Monroe Trotter, who maybe some people haven't heard of him, but William Monroe Trotter needs to be more well known, I feel, because he was a journalist who he and Ida B. Wells were very much in sync as far as being considered radical and difficult. And I guess if you try to tell the truth, you're considered difficult. But so they were her contemporaries. And the thing that have always found interesting is they didn't all get along. Okay. They had different ideas about how to solve the same problems. They agreed on the problems. They did not agree on the solutions. And I think, like, I meet a lot of students that are like, oh, history is boring. And I'm like, do you like soap operas? If you like soap operas, you'll need to read history, because these people did not always get along. They fought, they argued. And so those were her contemporaries. And then people who've come after her, that I think have been working in the same vein, or sort of continuing the work that she did, and she worked in a lot of different areas. So, for instance, John Johnson, I feel, is an extension of her as far as having Black-owned publications and telling our stories, taking our narrative into ourselves. Before I get to that, another contemporary or another person that she interacted with that is very important as far as who Ida was and how she fit into this history was Susan B. Anthony and Frances Willard. It's a long story. Read my book, okay? But it's a long story because these white women, she was interacting with them too. She didn't only operate in an all-Black world. She had to navigate within all of these different spaces, and so she had a different approach about certain things than some of the other women. More as far as contemporary, Colin Kaepernick, I feel kind of falls into her legacy of standing up for what you believe in and being willing to lose something for what you believe in. And I could just keep going on and on, but there are a lot of people who've worked in organizing, in voter registration. I mean, Stacey Abrams and Latasha Brown, when it comes to voting rights, and Jesse Jackson, when it comes to organizing. I mean, there's just a lot of people.
She was also really good friends with Marcus Garvey. And
Yes.
it wasn't William Trotter was the person that met her at the train to tell her not to go back to Memphis when her
That
press
was T. Thomas Fortune.
T. Thomas Fortune. When her press was destroyed because she had written the article about exposing the truth about Black men raping white women, and said it's a therefore lie. And so people thought that a man had wrote it. And so when she was met at the train, it was in Philadelphia, and the guy was like, where have you been for the last couple of days? We've been trying to get in touch with you to tell you that you can't go back to Memphis, because if you go back to Memphis, you're going to be lynched. And so so she had, like you mentioned. But the other thing, too, that's important to know is that when she becomes a founding member of the NAACP, she was very incensed with a lot of the people because they were not fighting lynching the same way that she was. They didn't take the same interest that she did, and so she was ostracized and kind of isolated from that. But we also have to think about the way in which Mary White Overton was funding the NAACP, so how money was involved. And so you think about in today's society, activists, politicians, people can be bought. And Ida was like, I'm not having any of that. So yeah.
Yeah. No, just a couple of additions. One is, as far as where she falls in history, so the affiliations that she had, we already discussed. Her being, to me, a fighter for justice and equality. 1898, she met with President William McKinley. She, along with a group of people, so it was not one-on-one, to try and get lynching to be a federal crime. 1898. And one of her frustrations with the NAACP, as you mentioned, is that she felt they weren't aggressive enough about fighting against lynching. And so, contextualizing that, I spoke at the U.S. Senate press conference in 2005. My friend Mark Planning is here, who helped organize that. The U.S. So for something to become a law, of course, it has to go through the House and then the Senate, or vice versa, and then be signed on by the president. 3 times in the 20th century, so making lynching a federal crime made it through the House and to the Senate, and the Senate did not sign off on it. So in 2005, they issued an apology. And I spoke there. Michelle and I attended the White House in 2022 when President Biden finally signed the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill. So when you talk about the intellectual genealogy, something that was started in 1898 officially, finally came to fruition just a couple of years ago.
Thank you for those responses. It's not lost on me that with Wells' inclusion on the quarter, alongside Althea Gibson, Stacey Park Milburn, Dr. Vera Rubin, and Juliette Gordon Lowe, that the event occurs in the wake of conversations about Harriet Tubman on currency. Although I have learned that coin and paper minting are different endeavors, what I recall about Tubman on the $20 bill was the ambivalence, dare we say anxiety, people felt about Black women on American currency. That said, how might we understand this moment in the wake of the discussions about Harriet Tubman?
I just think, as progressive as America touts itself to be, it's still, in the Stone Age when it comes to acknowledging and honoring women, all women, especially women of color. And some people were excited. Again, I remember the conversations years ago about Harriet Tubman, about whether that's appropriate or not. And, with Thomas Jefferson having owned slaves, which most any president during that time frame, so it's not picking out him specifically. But, so my personal opinion is we still need to do a far better job of respecting and honoring all women, and especially women of color.
That's my brother.
Well, the debate was on both sides of the coin. So there were people that were excited about it, and then there were people that were basically saying, it's fine to put Black women on money, but why not give us pay equity, right? And so when the discussion happened under the Biden administration, and Harriet won't be on the $20 bill, I think, until 2028 or 2030. And so a lot of people looked at it as if it was a Band-Aid. We're asking for you to erase student loan debt, and you give us Harriet on a $20 bill. We're asking you to stop killing Black people, and you give us Harriet on a $20 bill. So a lot of people looked at it as a Band-Aid to a larger societal problem. And then there were people like, okay, with Harriet being on the $20 bill, then people will have the $20 bill and have a discussion about who Harriet is. But in reality, how many people look at who's on their money, right? So that was the debate when it first came to discussion. So.
For what it's worth, it's quite auspicious to have Ida B. Wells' descendants here to commemorate this moment. So I guess I want to end by giving them the floor to discuss briefly memories or personal stories about her legacy. And then after that, we'll go into the Q&A.
Well, Daniel and I do not have personal stories of Ida B. Wells because she died several decades before we were born. But we have, I feel like what I have, I can't speak for Daniel, is the legacy that has been passed down through the generations. We are related to her through our father. So our father, so the way our generations go is that Ida B. Wells had 4 children. Her youngest daughter was our grandmother. And we knew our grandmother very well. We spent a lot of time with her. We used to go swimming. We used to go to the YMCA every Saturday with our father and our grandmother and our other brother. So we spent a lot of time with her, and our grandmother, for me, she didn't talk a lot about her mother. She really focused on us. I felt like my grandmother was a grandmother and not a lecturer. And she, to me, was like any other grandmother, where she would, we had birthday parties, we had holidays, we had, family gatherings that were not for holidays, and we would just hang out. It wasn't like, okay, I'm going to sit you in a circle and talk about my mother. But what she would talk about was kind of values, as far as you need to make sure that you stay in school and do the best that you can in school, because nobody can take away anything that's inside of your head. And that we needed to be the best at whatever we were good at. I never felt any pressure to follow in Ida B. Wells' footsteps or be another Ida, but to be the best Michelle that I could be. So to me, that was another value of, like, be the best you. And to also give back to your community. It's not all about you getting everything for you, and that's fine. It's like whatever talents and skills and information that you have, give back to other people, and to not feel that you're better than anybody or that you're intimidated by anybody, but everybody's equally important. So those are, to me, the values that were passed down. And that's not necessarily a story, but to me, it is a part of who Ida was.
Yeah, I agree. And oftentimes people who interview me or us, and this is, I've talked about Ida for 25 plus years. Michelle's talked about her for 30 years because she's older. But this is our first time sharing a stage. And so, yeah, some of the values were passed down, were intentional. And I didn't ask my dad about Ida probably until my late 20s, early 30s. And some of the values were, as Michelle mentioned, education. So for my grandmother had 5 children. All of them were valedictorian or salutatorian at their high school. All of them got advanced degrees in college. Their children were one of 15 great-grandchildren on that side. All of us attended college. Half of us, I'm not in that half, got advanced degrees. Michelle is in that half. And so education was important. Integrity was important. An intentional value that was passed down. I grew up, if it's not yours, don't touch it. I learned in college that doesn't work in a fraternity house. Right? I've got some CDs that still have not been returned to me. I'm kind of waiting on them. Again, giving back to the community, it's your duty, your responsibility. And don't be afraid of anything. One of my favorite quotes was from an incident that Ida experienced, where she was passing out buttons, speaking out against the government. Bottom line, 2 FBI officers are clearly law enforcement officials, threatened. It was like, if you keep passing these out, you may go to jail. And she was like, well, send me to jail if you need to. She's like, well, why would you do that? And there are 12 million Negroes who aren't willing to do that. And she said, essentially, I would consider it an honor to go to jail and speak out against the government for the dastardly deed that it's done, than to close my mouth and be safe and be amongst the other 11,999,999 other Negroes because they're too scared. So the men left and she was never arrested. But that type of courage is what we were also taught, is like, if it's a meaningful cause, fight for it. Stand up for what's right. So again, no memories. And again, that's one of the disappointing things when people interview us. They're like, well, did you ever meet her? It's like, you didn't do research. She died in 1931. So that's it.
Thank you for that. I'm going to read some questions now, so these are also for you all. The museum recently opened its exhibition about Mary McLeod Bethune and other Black women in activism. How might you define Wells as the quote-unquote godmother of Black women in activism that influenced Bethune and countless other women?
Well, Mary McLeod Bethune and Ida B. Wells were not that far apart in age, so I would consider them to be contemporaries. Also, she was a contemporary of Madam C.J. Walker, and one of my good friends, who's a descendant of hers, is in the audience. Thank you very much for your support. And we So as far as Mary McLeod Bethune specifically, like I said, I would consider them to be contemporaries, and they were both part of the National the National Association of Colored Women, and in fact, Mary McLeod Bethune ran against her to become president. So they were kind of rivals when it came to that particular organization. I don't know a lot of information about their relationship with each other. A lot of it, Ida B. Wells wrote an autobiography, and she died several decades before I was born. And so a lot of information that we have access to is based on what she wrote. And even if you wrote your own story, people edit. They censor and edit what they decide to write about. And that was one thing she did not write a lot of detail about as far as her relationship with Mary McLeod Bethune. So as far as I know, it was more of a kind of professional type of interaction.
How would Ida be a journalist today? Would she be active on social media? What would she have to say about Black life and the experience of women in the present?
So those questions are always interesting because again, it's about my interpretation and of what Ida would do and so forth. So I think that she if you have the opportunity, read her writings. She was brilliant, and journalism was very different back then because it had to be, right? So the only media source was the newspaper for the most part. So when she was coming up, so it was also involved a lot more storytelling instead of the media right now is snippets and bite-sized things that people can digest and move on. So I think she'd be true to the journalist that she was and being able to tell the full story unashamedly and doing her own fact-checking.
I think she would be active on social media. If you think about the women who started Black Lives Matter, they started on social media. And so when her three friends are lynched, and so when she asked her, what are your final words from Thomas Moss, he said, tell the people go west. And so she writes the story, and she tells the people to leave. And so they do. I think, what is it, like 7,000 people in like a month or something left. And so she had the businesses that come and plead with her to write an editorial to tell the people not to leave. And she was like, no, I'm telling them to leave because she didn't say these words, but essentially she said Black Lives Matter. And so I think she would be on social media, and I think she would be engaged in certain kinds of ways with what is happening in society. So I think she would be on social media.
My guess is as good as theirs, so.
From our virtual audience, who did Ida B. Wells mentor and influence? Does she have any acolytes? You've named some.
Right. So to my knowledge, I don't know anybody that she directly mentored, if you will. The influence, I'd say, is pervasive. So one of the reasons she wrote her autobiography is that she was asked by a younger woman, this was in the early 1920s when Ida was around 60. The woman asked her, pretty much, what did you do? Or why are you a big deal? Right? And Ida was like, oh man, like I need to record my history so that people will know. So I think through her writing her autobiography, that's what gave her the influence. But to my knowledge, I don't recall her mentoring anybody specifically.
And I didn't come across any of that in my research that she mentored anyone. So,
what can you share about the mental strain and stress of the work Ida engaged in? How did she practice rest?
I'll answer that question because when you think about her contemporary, W.E. Du Bois, he lives 30 years longer than Ida. She died when she was 68, and he lived till he was 95 or something like that. And so if you just, and I've looked at this before just because I've studied her face, and you could just see all the stress in her face. because of all the work that she was doing when she left Memphis and went to Chicago. And she did all this work when she started the Alpha Suffrage. Yeah, because the black men couldn't go to the YMCA. And she just worked tirelessly. She was just always doing something, advocating for causes for black people. And I don't know if she did rest, because even when she had her babies, she still went. I mean, there was a conversation between her. Someone was getting ready to be lynched, and she wasn't going to go. She tells her husband, "I'm not going." And her son comes to her and say, "You have to go, because if you don't go, who is going to go?" And she says, "I get up and I put my clothes on and I go." So I don't know if she did rest. I don't know if she had practices of rest.
Yeah, no, that's my joke, is that she had to sleep well because she did so much during the day, right? You know, when you, like, again, she was one of those, and it's a challenge. You know, a lot of times we say, "Oh, there's a problem. Somebody needs to do something." She would say, "Something needs to be done. I'm going to do it." Right. So she started the Negro Fellowship League to help specifically black men who had migrated and were having a challenge. And again, started the first black kindergarten, or kindergarten for black students in Chicago. Started a number of organizations. And I agree with you. When you look, and there aren't many pictures that really are, because, you know, photography was not as popular back then, so there were naturally not as many photographs. But when you look at the photographs of the decades, she aged dramatically. So I agree.
This is a virtual question, but I think we have the answer. Will the Mint donate a coin to the museum? But we saw the ceremony prior. Why do you think she named her eldest daughter Ida Jr.?
So, because that's Ida. So Ida, again, married Ferdinand Barnett, who was actually a widower. And so the short story on there, he was a widower. He had married another black woman who was one of the first, if not the first, black woman to go to Michigan, University of Michigan. And so she passed, and he was like, you know, he wanted to marry another strong black woman. And so she was, after she moved, chose not to go back to Memphis. And again, when she wrote the article about the lynching, it is not in our autobiography, but we have talked about it and feel that she was strategically out of town when she published that, because she knew it was going to cause problems. But yeah, so she came to Chicago in 1893 for the World's Fair, where she was invited by Frederick Douglass, who was her mentor, contemporary and mentor, and that's when she met Ferdinand Barnett, and together they wrote a pamphlet talking about the absence of the Negro at the World's Fair. And so when Ferdinand met her, he was like, "Yeah, we need to get married." Ferdinand had a junior, and so Ida wanted her own junior. So it's not written, but that's my assumption is, well, if you got a junior, I want a junior too. Your impression of the show. So we've never talked about this.
Yeah.
Anything else you all would like to add? We have a little bit of time, so I want to open up to the panelists if they want to add, share.
So for me, sometimes I do photography and look at fashion. And so Ida B. Wells loved clothes. And so she writes about it in her autobiography, and she talks about how she would chastise herself because she spent so much money on clothes. She loved pretty clothes. Even when she was drug off the train, she talked about she had on this beautiful duster, and it was torn and stuff. And so I love the fact that she loved clothes. And so and she was a huge fan of fashion.
Mine would be a call to action of sorts. Again, I get asked to do speeches, and of course, Black History Month is a more popular time to do the speeches. But one of my keynotes is Leading Wells, which is an acronym for Be Wise with Your Choices, Be Excellent with Your Actions, Live with Integrity, Lead with Courage, and Speak with Passion. And so being wise with your choices, she always made the choices I say not that she didn't take it personally. In addition to taking it personally, she made the problem bigger than herself, right? So being thrown from the train, she took it personally, but she also made the problem bigger than herself. She sued the railroad, right? Being excellent with your actions, that's something we were taught, is do your best. No matter what you do your best. Live with integrity. Not only do the right thing, but God has given each and every one of us certain gifts. It's our responsibility, it's our duty to operate within those gifts and do the best we can. Lead with courage. To me, to have integrity, you've got to have courage. Because to have integrity, you're going to have to say no. You're going to have to piss some people off. It takes courage to do that. And then speak with passion. So again, in giving back to the community, you're standing up for the rights of yourself or for others. You also have to speak with passion. So find something you're passionate about and pursue it with passion. Speak with passion. Live with passion.
Well, one of the things that struck me while I was doing tons of research for my book, Ida B. the Queen, was how I don't think that it's possible for somebody to plan their life. Like you have these, people are all into like vision boards and, 10-step program and all these, how you read these articles about how to set your goals and that kind of thing. I think it's good. You actually do need to have some idea in your head of like what you care about and maybe what your overall sort of value system and goals are. But one of the things that I've taken from her life is that if you just have sort of a guiding post of what you care about and what your value system is, then sometimes things will fall into place that you can't predict. I don't think that she ever knew, 5 years, 10 years in advance that, my friends are going to be killed and I'm going to write an article and then that's going to cause death threats and I'm going to end up living in New York and I'm going to go to England and then I'm going to go to Chicago and then I'm going to get married. And like all of these things happened in 3 years. Between 1892 and 1895, her entire life changed. And she made choices on how she was going to react to the different situations that came her way, but I don't think she could have ever planned it. And so what I've taken away was that she didn't know what was going to happen, but she was prepared for what came up. Because when she was teaching 4th grade, she taught 4th grade her entire teaching career, and she was bored. And she didn't make it a secret that she was bored teaching. And so in her free time, she wrote for church newsletters. She participated in like what they call lyceums, which were like writing groups of book clubs and people going to churches and talking about things. She took acting classes. She took what were called elocution classes, which were basically public speaking. She was doing all this when she was a teacher. How would she have ever been able to know that she was going to end up giving speeches in England 3-4 years later? But she was prepared and she was doing something because she enjoyed doing it. So when the opportunity came, she already had the skill set. And so my final point is that I think it's important to pursue what you're interested in, even if it's not a career, because you don't know how it's going to maybe fit into what you don't know is going to happen in the future, but you're prepared for it. And that's how I thought, my theories on how she could step into what she ultimately did, because she had the skill set.
And I think it's important to piggyback, to step into, so you go back when she's 16 and she becomes a surrogate parent for her siblings, and even advocating for keeping her siblings together against the community and the people saying, you can't do this. And she's like, my parents would roll over in their grave if I don't keep this family together. And so I think that set her on a course for, teaching and all the things that she did, because at 16 years old, her life was radically changed. She became a surrogate parent to her siblings and kept her family together against the odds of what everybody else thought should happen. And so, it kind of sent the community into this kind of moral panic, because it's like, how is that she is going to take care of these children. But she did. I mean, she had help from the family and stuff like that. But I just think that when she made that decision to keep her siblings together, that was a critical moment to her life's path.
So on behalf of myself and my panelists, I want to thank them, and I want to thank you all. And also to the Smithsonian for housing us and hosting us. And I guess I can say have a good night.